Hi, third period lit. Since Cameron was so generous to provide us with a video explaining the movie poster yesterday, I thought that I would do the same with my explication today, since I won't be here. It's difficult to have discussion and on video, so I'm going to pause at certain points in the explication, and at that point hopefully we can have some class discussion about what I've said and possibly what I've gotten wrong or what other people want to add to what I've said. And also, if anybody has any comments or questions while I'm saying something, please just raise your hand and we can pause the video and let us know what you're thinking, because I won't be here, so it doesn't matter if you interrupt me. Okay, so let's get started. Hamlet begins with a pretty tricky question: to be or not to be? And that is the question. And on its surface, maybe considering the rest of this passage, maybe he's just talking about death, and whether he's talking about is it better to be alive or is it better to be dead. But also he's sort of talking about is it better to be in a state of knowledge or not to be in a state of knowledge, or is it better to be the loyal son and take revenge on Claudius, or is it better not to be and not have these major consequences on the rest of the court and on all these people he knows? Is it better to be as Gertrude is, a survivor? I mean, is it better to adapt to the environment, or is it better not to be? Is it better to fight against the environment? And this is what Hamlet wants to do. So he's posing all the questions that he has in the entire play right here in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words. And it's pretty existential too. So he's wondering, what should I do? He doesn't know what he needs to do. He's having questions about his actions, what his future actions should be. It is very direct, though, very immediate. So he's not trying to get around it. He's not delaying. At least he's not delaying when it comes to figuring out what he needs to do. He's struggling with it head on, really. And so he continues on with this train of thought of to be or not to be, as in death. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Right here in these couple of sentences, what he's really saying is it nobler to continue on with life, even in the face of this mistreatment and of these terrible circumstances of having to live in such misery, or is it better to fight against it and the eventual consequence of that is to die? The way he words it sort of says a little bit about himself too. When he asks whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, this phrase in the mind is specific, is oddly specific, because it makes you question whether it's in the mind of the general populace or whether it's in the mind of Hamlet. So is it nobler in the mind, in the collective mind? Is it nobler generally to stay alive and continue on, persevere even if you can never win? Or is he asking whether it is nobler in Hamlet's mind, in Hamlet's notably different mind? Does Hamlet prefer to stay alive and persevere, or does Hamlet prefer to give up, well, it's not giving up, but to die? And then that's sort of this next part, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So now he's fighting against his circumstances. He's fighting against what he feels to be unjust, but he knows that by doing so he's going to die. So he poses this question: which one is better? What's the more desirable course of action? And it's interesting that Hamlet assigns these two options these different these different motivations. So whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer this things and errors of outrageous fortune, if Hamlet chooses that option, what he's saying to himself is he's being submissive and subservient to fate, and he's just giving in to fate. And obviously he doesn't want to do that, but it's interesting that he would think of staying alive in that manner as opposed to, you know, winning. He doesn't think it's winning to stay alive, and he thinks it is winning to fight against the troubles and die. And that's kind of suicide. He's talking about suicide because he knows he's going to die and he's going to do it anyways. So he thinks that committing suicide or fighting against Claudius in this doomed battle is defiant, and that he is being noble, and he is honoring the spirit of his father in doing so. Or maybe he's getting back at Claudius for his mother. You know, his motivations aren't the clearest. I'll pause for a second. Okay, and continuing on, still staying in this section, Hamlet is pretty final in these options that are given to him. It's either one or the other, is what he's telling himself. You can give in and you can decide to survive and stay alive, or you can be defiant and fight against them, but you'll die. He finishes his question, and by opposing, end them. If he does this, it's going to end. It's going to be the final thing he does, and he recognizes that. In these 4 lines, there's also a lot of imagery, a lot of military or a lot of warlike imagery, and that sort of reflects how he feels. He's fighting against the status quo, or he's fighting against death, to be able to make his mark through death instead of the usual just dying and oh boo-hoo, you're dead. But he thinks of himself as a fighter, as rebelling against all the terrible things that have been done to him, and that he thinks have been done, all the wrongs that he thinks have been perpetrated. Something to keep in mind while reading this passage, while I'm going through this passage, is that there are 3 different ways to look at it. One way to look at this passage is that Hamlet is completely unaware of what is going on in this scene with Ophelia. So he walks in to whatever room, and he gives his little spiel about to be or not to be. He sees Ophelia, and they have their conversation, and Hamlet is none the wiser of Claudius and Polonius's presence. And in that case, this passage is a real reflection of what Hamlet thinks and what he's feeling, of the emotional strife that he's going through. The second option, or the second way that you could look at it, is that Hamlet comes in initially unaware of what's going on, but sort of figures it out partway through. And if you're thinking about it that way, then you might think that he figures it out sometime in this passage, or sometime while he's talking to Ophelia. Either way, this first part, this to be or not to be, this whether 'tis nobler, his consideration of suicide as a path out is still very real. And then the third way to look at it is that Hamlet is clever, and he's wise to the scheming ways of Claudius and Polonius, and he knows what's going on, and he goes into this meeting prepared to give a performance, and that's what this is. It's just a performance, and he's talking about killing himself and death just to frighten Claudius sorry, and Polonius maybe. And if he does so, obviously it doesn't work so well because Claudius doesn't believe him. But that's another way to look at it. Personally, I think that at this point he doesn't know what's going on, and that this passage is a good representation of his state of mind, his troubled state of mind, and the issues that he thinks are the most important. But that's just my opinion. Actually, this would be a good time to ask the class if anyone has any opinions on what's going on here and how that affects this passage in particular. His statements about death and what's the value of life and what happens after life. You know, is that real or is that false? So we can just take a couple of minutes, hopefully, if someone has something to say. Okay, hopefully there was some good discussion. If not, oh well. Moving on. Now Hamlet has established one of the main questions that he wants to address, at least in the first part of this passage, which is stay alive or commit suicide. You know, what are the benefits of one over the other, and which one is right? But then also which one is going to have the greatest effect on him, and what does he think about these two choices? So he's really more drawn to the fighting against fate and then dying. It's kind of morbid, but he sees himself as a fighter, and he doesn't want to be submissive to fate. He doesn't want to just go with the flow. So he starts talking about what it means to be dead, because when he's thinking about you know, killing himself or putting himself in a position to be killed quite quickly, death is going to be one of the first things that's on his mind, and he really wants to come to terms with what death means. So he says, to die, to sleep, no more. So here he equates dying and sleeping, which is interesting because it shows that he doesn't think that dying is quite as permanent as we might think it is. I mean, I don't think, not that he thinks he can come back from the dead, but he thinks that he can still exist in death, that he's just going to be sleeping, that he won't be conscious, but he will be there, and that there will be some part of him that stays in existence. And by a sleep, to say, we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So here Hamlet sort of talks, he sort of gives an insight into why he might want to commit suicide. So he doesn't like the way things are in his life. There's heartache, there's 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. It's not a pleasant situation for Hamlet. So by sleeping, by dying and falling into an eternal sleep, he can end all of this, and that is attractive to him. So in this whole passage, there are a couple of occurrences of humor, which they serve to lighten the mood. They don't lighten the mood too much. It's still a very dark and very heavy passage, but Shakespeare is able to insert a little bit of humor into this situation, and it sort of is an indicator that Hamlet might not be all that crazy, or that he might not be so overtaken with emotion that he's just that he can't stop himself from thinking about suicide and death. He's still quite functional, and quite functional enough that he can use humor in his speech. And the humor here that I'm referring to is after this, to die, to sleep, this first part, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. The consummation here that he's referring to is the consummation of death and the end of life, which is interesting when you think about the other use of the word consummation, which is the beginning of life, pretty much. He takes that wordplay a step farther when he says it's a consummation devoutly to be wished. And this word devoutly, especially with its religious undertones, is sort of ironic in this context with the consummation that it will be wished devoutly. So there's just a little bit of humor there to brighten your day. So then Hamlet starts repeating what he has said earlier, to die, to sleep. So this is something he's really concerned with, is thinking about what death means to him, and what this idea of death as sleep means to him. So to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. So now he's done thinking about sleeping and dying, and so he's come to the conclusion that yes, dying is kind of like sleeping. So he will still exist. He just won't be able to. He won't be consciously existing, but he will be able to end all his troubles and all of that. Great. Now let's get to the consequences of dying. And the consequences of dying here are dreaming. So he'll sleep, to sleep perchance to dream. Well, if he sleeps, he has to dream. And there's the rub. That is what is troubling him, because it wouldn't be hard to imagine that Hamlet doesn't have the greatest dreams. Probably has a lot of nightmares. You could probably tell a lot from his dreams, but he thinks of dreaming as this integral part of sleep, and so dreaming will become an integral part of death. And in this case, dreaming is sort of like the afterlife. What happens in the afterlife? He is a little bit afraid of nightmares. So, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come? I mean, it's the sleep of death. It's a very ominous sleep, and you might have nightmares. You might, the bad stuff might be coming, and in that case, Hamlet is referring to the fact that he might go to hell. He's very religious, so he thinks of a few places that he could go after he dies, and one of those places would be hell. And if he commits suicide, according to his faith, that's where he would go, according to the I want to say 1500s Protestant faith. Or he could go to heaven, but he's really afraid of that question. It's not a guarantee, and he obviously does not want to spend eternity in hell. So there's the rub. That is what might be preventing him, and it's not the only thing, but that's one of the things that's preventing him from committing suicide, or really taking arms against the injustice that has been committed against him by Claudius, because he'll know he'll die, and it might be really in a situation that would send him to hell. Or you could look at it as, it's another excuse for delay. Oh, I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me after I die, so I better not do anything just in case I die. So he's talking about what is going to come after death, and that is one of the main things that this passage is concerned with, is the afterlife. Okay, so when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, the mortal coil being earth and shuffling being kicking the bucket, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. What dreams may come must give us pause. So now he's saying not only is he worried about it, but he should be worried about it. He must be worried about it, because what kind of a crazy person would he be not to be worried about where he's going to spend eternity? It must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. And the words he uses here are a little bit misleading, both to the audience and to himself. He says, there's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. It's not really respect that he's referring to, though, it's fear. Hamlet has a fear of what comes after, and that is what is keeping him in check. It's a fear that makes the calamity of so long life. Obviously, Hamlet is not very happy with his life, and here he sort of sums that up as a calamity. It's a disaster. He hates it. He's miserable. Oh, woe is Hamlet. But that sort of gives another insight into his mind. He's not just considering suicide because he's a little bit depressed and Claudius is a terrible person and his mother has betrayed him. It's because he thinks his whole life is disaster, and he thinks it is such a disaster that he doesn't really place any value in his life. Not the same kind of value that a normal person would, I don't want to say normal, but that others might place in their lives. And that sort of links back to the whether 'tis noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So by living, he doesn't think he's gaining anything. He thinks he's just being submissive. And that is directly related to the next line, which is, "For who would bear the whips and scorns of time?" And actually this marks a transition from him questioning what he knows or what might be the truth about death and the afterlife into for himself, into a sort of a more general investigation, general exploration of life for man or woman, but mankind, humankind. What it means to be alive, what it would mean to die, and what keeps people living once Hamlet's reached his conclusion that living's not so great after all, and that comes near the end. So this first line, this line here, "For who would bear," that's like the first line where he starts talking about what is life and death for a more general population. "For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes?" That's a long list of grievances that Hamlet has against life. It's not a very pretty picture for him. He pretty much just lists the terrible things, and that is what life is for him. He doesn't see the beauty in life. Excuse me. All he sees in life is tragedy and betrayal and oppression and love ruined. That's the shape that his life has taken, and that's the life that he assumes that that's the shape that he assumes everyone's life must take. So he's doing a little bit of philosophy here. What is the meaning of life? But he's not the greatest of philosophers, because his philosophy is limited to his unique and limited experience. So then, after thinking about what life means to mankind, well, what does death mean to mankind, and why don't regular people think the way I do? Why don't they debate whether they should kill themselves? So the patient man of the unworthy, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin. And Hamlet really presents this as the desirable option. Why would he go through all this when he could just do that? It's so easy. He could just stab himself in the chest, and that is the bare bodkin, is a dagger. Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life? So who fardels is burdens? Who would bear these burdens? Who would be oppressed like this? Who would be a slave to life? Again, more links back to how Hamlet refers to himself. But who would be a slave to life if he could just escape it? But then here comes another thing I want to add here is that Hamlet really doesn't differentiate between different classes of people. Hamlet's a noble, and of course in that last explication he refers to himself as a slave, and there's some sort of there's a bit of a class shift there, where he's referring to himself as a lower class. Well, here he is referring to everyone as a lower class. He's surrounded by nobles, but he doesn't give them any special treatment when it comes to life. They still have to endure the whips and scorns of times and the pangs of despised loves, and they still have to grunt and sweat like a dirty commoner. So tragedy then is the ultimate equalizer in Hamlet's eyes, or perhaps it just has equalized them to Hamlet, and it's not something that he perceives consciously. Either way, this is something that Shakespeare is saying. But that the dread of something after death. So other people have the same concern he does, that there might be something that is not so welcoming waiting for them on the other side of the veil, and that is one reason that he gives himself as to why other people aren't considering suicide the way he is. He doesn't really see himself as troubled I mean, obviously he knows that there's something that he knows that he's in emotional turmoil, but he doesn't think that it's so odd that he's considering suicide, which is something that most people would consider odd. So he sort of thinks that everyone must be avoiding death because they think that there might be something terrible afterwards, not because life is a wonderful thing to begin with. And that's what he was saying earlier, is that, you know, there's no reason to like life. So the only reason that you wouldn't want to die is because you're afraid of death and what comes with death. And so what comes with death is the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. So he is creating an entirely separate realm now. We've moved out of the world of the mortals into the world of into the spirit world, I guess, the world of those who have been dead, those who are dead, still dead. And it's separate. It's separate from the world that Hamlet lives in and the world that he's been describing, this world of tragedy. It's separate from this. I mean, a little bit of outside perspective from Euro right now. It's separate from the nationalistic troubles. So at that time, you know, all the countries have issues with each other, but the other side is just one country. It's all one country, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns. It is, you know, it's the final. If you go there, you got to stay there. It's the realm of death, and it's a mystery to Hamlet. It's a mystery to people that are alive, but he still believes that that exists. That there's another place, and that place either is going to be good to him or bad to him, and that is what he's trying to decide here. I'm just going to go get some water. Okay, I'm back. Now we are at the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. So Hamlet is grappling with the idea of the afterlife, and really it's kind of like a challenge to him, because while he thinks a lot of people, most people, would not want to risk the afterlife, and to an extent Hamlet doesn't. I mean, he's spent already much of the passage talking about how he doesn't. You know, he's concerned. He's afraid of what lies beyond. There's also a little part of him that doesn't care, or that thinks that the other side must be better than what he's experiencing now, just because he is in such great misery that anything has to be better. And that is here where he says, the dread of something after death puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. So he's saying that it's that fear that is keeping people, and he's also talking about himself here, that's keeping himself back from, and he says it's flying to others that we know not of. And this word fly it's interesting that he uses fly instead of, say, I don't know, sail, like, you know, Charon's boat, or walk. I mean, he uses fly, and fly is a fairly uplifting mode of transportation. It's an uplifting word. It's like soar. So this word fly suggests that he thinks that traversing to this other world from which no one can return, so, you know, making that permanent step into death, is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's something that he thinks could be freeing, that could free him from the burdens, from the fardels of his life now. It's sort of a hopeful tone, which is odd considering the tone of the rest of the passage and its theme concerning death. But here, he's in these very few words, he's sort of saying that it might be a good thing, and that it's something that he thinks that he almost wants to do is to go to the other side, even though he has this fear, even though there's a chance of nightmares. He wants to fly to this other world, and he wants to ascend off of, pathetic, dirty Earth, or whatever he thinks of Earth. And so this is right back to considering suicide again. He spent a good portion of the middle talking about philosophizing on life and death and what it means for mankind. And he's talking about what death means to man here, but there's this little part where he sort of regresses to considering suicide for himself, and that sort of shows I think shows the emotional instability of Hamlet, where it's something that is weighing so heavily on his mind that he can't escape thinking of it. But onto the words around it. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And so he is saying that this fear, this holding everyone back, it makes us cowards. It makes people cowards. And the way that he phrases it, the way that he says that it's cowards of us all, of everyone, even these people he's never met, that don't have the same problems as him. It shows that his whole world is contained within himself. He doesn't have a ton of experience with the outside world, and so his private experiences have become all that he knows of the world. And so this is a contrast here. This line is a contrast between morality, between individual morality and values that are propagated by the church. It's interesting for Hamlet to say that conscience is going to make someone a coward. Usually conscience is thought of as doing good things. But since the conscience in Hamlet's mind is what's preventing someone from fleeing their own misery, it makes them a coward. In the eyes of the church, they would be a sinner. And their conscience would be correct to keep them from killing themselves. And since Hamlet is assumedly a fairly religious person, having studied in Wittenberg, he has trouble reconciling the two different value systems that have emerged. So one could think that he probably followed the church value system, and that's probably what he believes to be moral. He follows the morals of the church. But now that he's had these experiences, and now that he's considering suicide, he sees that maybe there is something more, something that he can choose for himself. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. And this is Hamlet's final thoughts, his conclusions on all of this. He's saying that making a decision is natural, and that maybe even the decision of suicide would be a natural decision, something that he could understand, something that he didn't think it would be a sin, that it's something that he is even considering. It is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. It is made ill. It's made worse with all of this, this thinking about, well, what comes after death? What do I have to fear? When what Hamlet wants is an immediate decision, and that sort of ties back to the beginning, where he sets it forth very directly. To be or not to be, that is the question. He wants an answer, and here he's saying, well, you have to provide yourself. He has to provide himself with an answer, and he needs to stop. He's sort of telling himself he needs to stop delaying. Obviously, he doesn't stop delaying for a little while, but here is where he's sort of gearing himself up. Okay, and then he sort of finishes up, and enterprises of great pith and moment with disregard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action. So if he doesn't if he doesn't get to it now, he's not going to be able to act. He's going to lose the name of action. He's going to lose his chance. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. So he's come to his conclusions, and now he's ready to address Ophelia. And going with the idea of Hamlet's soliloquy here as a performance for Claudius and Polonius, he's made his point. He's shown how mad he is, at least he thinks he has, and now he can show them how much contempt he has for Ophelia. Or if you think of it the other way, that he doesn't know, then he was introspective, and now that there's someone else, he has to put on his facade for them, and he's performing now for Ophelia, rather than just being his true self. Soft you now, the fair Ophelia. It's interesting the way that he says this, because the words he says after this wouldn't suggest that he thinks that Ophelia is fair. And of course we had the discussion about whether or not he really does love Ophelia, and whether he remains loving Ophelia, but the words that he says to her face and the words that he says now to himself are obviously very different. Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. Here's getting back to a little bit of the problems he has with women. He says the fair Ophelia, but then he says, in Ophelia, all my sins are remembered. And this sort of ties back to the biblical references, the biblical parallels that we were drawing with Ophelia being Eve, maybe Gertrude being Eve, but here Ophelia encompasses the sins. I mean, she is not, but she makes him remember the sins, as Eve sort of introduced sin to man. And that is getting into the next part, and that is getting into a different theme than Hamlet is presenting in this to be or not to be speech. So that is just my quick explication, and it would be really wonderful if we could have a class discussion on this passage, especially on these latter parts that I have just covered, on Hamlet's broader interpretation of life and death, and of suicide, and of morality, of all of this, and what the class thinks of Hamlet, perhaps of what Hamlet's state of mind is, and what they think Shakespeare is trying to say. Thank you.